The theme of the 12th Annual Thabo Mbeki Lecture is the African Union at 20. The focus is on strengthening political parties and liberation movements as the continent moves to spur its growth and progress. To discuss the African Union and the impact of its work, let's welcome Dr. David Monyae, Associate Professor of Political Science and International Relations at the University of Johannesburg, and Advocate Sipho Mantula, who is researcher at the Thabo Mbeki African School on Public and International Affairs. Good evening, gentlemen, and thank you very much for your time. Before we get to the depth of the issue, let's perhaps start with this. How well is the AU known on the continent, and by whom? Is it the first institution that comes to mind when we talk about African progress? David, maybe we kick off with you.
Well, indeed. I think the AU is well known from OAU to now AU. I think people on the ground are quite aware that on an annual basis, head of states meet and that the body governs issues of continental concerning our continent, and whenever we have conflicts or any other major issue on the African continent, the AU plays that central role. It's well known within the elite circles, even people on the ground, but I really do not think that the norms and values and certain function, technical elements of it, if people on the ground are quite aware of it.
Well, would you concur with that, Sipho?
You know, Imam, Jumbo Africa, even to your viewers on this day, very important. I would say our community are aware of the then OAU before the AU, because some others say the only difference from AU, there is no O. I think the AU is not organized now. Almost a decade ago, when we have to look back. And I'm worried even if we have lectures on this Africa Week focus or Africa Liberation Week moment or Africa Day, as the Chancellor was saying today when I was reading his piece, when he was trying to justify why they moved from Africa Liberation Day to Africa Day. When we see that many African communities, man, are not liberated, they are still captured and still caught up in the colonial settings and thinking, and that's why I will think Falol this evening must touch on his thinking around the epistemology, around curriculum change in our institutions of higher learning, and what is this demand of African century, the 21st century that we have been saying it's an African century. And I think Falol will even touch on the issues around the impact of globalization and neo-imperialism, which is the last stage that Nkrumah said it is capitalism.
David, let me bring you in then on, just some of the strands of what Sipho is talking about there. A reconscientization, in a sense, or reconfiguration about how we relate with ourselves and how we relate with the continent and what are identified as objectives for the continent insofar as its growth and progress is concerned. How do we accelerate that agenda?
I think to understand the past, during the liberation struggle, most nationalist movements and people on the ground who were fighting and ordinary people knew their leaders, and also they knew at sub-regional and continental there are these bodies that are assisting, and therefore the OAU and prominent African leaders, Ken Kaunda, Julius Nyerere, Kwame Nkrumah, were well known and associated with the liberation agenda. And in the post-independence, and particularly after 2002, with the formation of the AU, it then changed in terms of the mechanisms of how to operationalize, in terms of issues of governance with different areas of focus. But there are certain elements where people are not much more closer to the AU. They are aware of it, but what we see at the African Parliament at times is the negative elements of it. Issues of corruption, endless coups on the continent, hunger, climate change matters, and you really do not see or hear most of the AU playing an active role on the ground. And therefore I think it's a question of changing that, ensure that people are directly seeing, feel, and see the action of the AU in their day-to-day lives. I think that's what is needed.
Given what you've just said and some of the observations you make about where certain agendas might succeed, where they might not be able to reach their targets, and I suppose we might think of things like, the mantra for 2020, which was around silencing the guns and a focus on peace, and yet we are still living in a highly conflictuous environment on the continent. With that in mind, what keeps the AU evergreen and relevant in terms of its own policy then, Sipho? Does that mechanism exist for it to demonstrate the agility that is needed to respond to things that are happening now?
The mechanism, Imam, I don't think so. And as me and you were speaking now, they are meeting in Malabo, trying to amend or to adjust to this a new law. I mean the previous charter on election, democratization and governance. And when I looked, Ma'am, my fear is that yes, the OAU to AU looked at three things that I thought of: integration, which was people to people; prosperous, which is fruitful; conducive, developmental Africa, and peaceful Africa. But today, me and you, Imam, we're speaking of military coups that have raised an ugly head once more, but showing a poor leadership. So the mechanism, again, is that elections a panacea to this misgovernance and under-governance? And I know Falol, again, he will still talk about, but maybe the AU have forgotten its region, which is the African diaspora. And we tapped on our African diaspora knowledge in terms of dealing with the current challenges that are facing the African continent.
So what is the panacea that is available, David, within the AU now to redirect, to become more effective, and indeed to galvanize more people to be a part of its, the execution of its mandate?
I think what is key is to have common norms and values around issues of elections, how we manage elections, and ensure that the AU is not a top-down kind of approach in its governance, that all decisions are just made by head of states. They have to wait until end of year and put all these refuse and silencing the gun, which was very wishful thinking. And people, what they see on the ground, there has been more coups than any other decade. So it really contradicts what they do. The second most important thing is to ensure that we mobilize resources on key and central issues such as peacekeeping. We cannot rely on external powers to keep our own peace. And while we're building this new free trade agreement, the Secretariat itself, we should not get sponsorship from external people who we're going to trade with. And those are key principal issues where we close ranks as Africa, raise our own resources. We have lots of resources in terms of human capital, even money, through taxation or any other means, ensure that on these key areas that we're going to really close rank and we don't allow external people. And when it comes to also intellectual input, you cannot rely on external researchers to tell you what to do. And so those are some of the issues that we really need to do and be hard among ourselves, anti-corruption throughout the continent, and ensure that we trade more among ourselves. Those are practical areas where AU become a meaningful institution for our continent.
All right, well, let's just stay with the issue of trade since you've invoked it now. And David, I'll start with you and I'll get a comment from you on this as well, Sipho. The distance between, a strategic objective and, of course, a lot of people say a lot of things about the AU's Agenda 2063. It's way too far in the future. Those who have conceived of it now probably won't even be around to witness whether it ever reached fruition or not. But it's this disconnect between having a stated objective and not being cognizant of the very real obstacles that stand in the way of its realization. Take, for example, the the Continental Free Trade Agreement. And as colleagues have written, you have this ambitious goal to connect the economies of the continent, but no infrastructure to support that stated goal. How do we make sense of that?
We have to be much more practical. At the moment, we trade among ourselves only 12%. Perhaps it has gone up to 16% now, and the bulk of our trade is the external powers, and that in itself, it's not what's happening in Asia, Latin America, and the like. Most continental bodies such as AU, they trade among themselves above 50%. I think we need to do that by practically dealing with closing those gaps, infrastructure, ensure that what we do, the execution of the Agenda 2063 does not happen at AU, nor does it happen at the regional economic community level. It happens at the national level. However, when we do plans in SADC, we have to ensure that infrastructure built in Swaziland or in Lesotho, in Zimbabwe, any one of the SADC countries, those infrastructure do speak to each other, so that we have this network of regional interconnectedness in terms of rail, with the harbour, airlines, ensure that we have common visa for the region, so that when tourists come to South Africa, they are able to go to other parts of the continent with less problems. Now, at the moment, we're still operating on stringent way of movement of people and poor infrastructure.
David, please pardon my poor manners interjecting there. I really do apologize. I'm so sorry.
Sure.
But we're going to, the moment, I suppose, has arrived where we understand that lecture is now kicking off. So I'm just going to thank you very much, David Monyae and Sipho Mantula, for sharing your analysis with us.